So to conclude this section, in this structure, mental health institutions ended up institutionalizing far more people than prisons at the time. This is a graph that's created by University of Chicago Professor Bernard Harcourt. And he just does the figures of people in psychiatric hospitals. I apologize if that's cut off. He doesn't include the number of people in state schools. So actually the number of people in mental health institutions would be higher than it was. So it reached about 500,000 there in the 1950s or mid 20th century, while you can see the number of people incarcerated was actually significantly lower. To bring this to life some, in the early 1960s, Eastern State here, I think, had roughly 1,000, although I'm sure there are people in this room who could answer this question, but I think there are about roughly 1,000 people. At Byberry, there were over 6,000 people, and that's Philadelphia State Hospital in northeast Philadelphia. And Pennhurst, which is out in Spring City, had about 3,000. So again, Eastern State Penitentiary as a place of institutionalization actually paled in comparison to mental health institutions in the mid 20th century. The second section, institutionalizing America. Using this lens of both mental hospitals and prisons, this question of deinstitutionalization suddenly doesn't appear to be the right word at all. So if you look at this chart, which is incredibly helpful, deinstitutionalization actually doesn't happen as much, well, it's not that it doesn't happen in the 1980s, but it actually begins as early as the 1950s, as you can see with the release of people. To nursing homes, to community mental health, to communities, to families. So that begins in the 1950s, and then it continues. The public, psychiatric professionals, and advocates were all calling at that time in the 1960s for alternatives to large mental health institutions. The Community Mental Health Act of 1963, passed by John F. Kennedy, in particular, fostered federal leadership of community care of the mentally ill. And if you can see, this image to me just kind of brings it to light. There's the central state hospital, and then the ideal is to move it into community-based settings. This is also an image of the superintendent at Byberry in the late 60s, early 70s, where he's trying to predict the downsizing of Byberry, the release of all of the people there through deinstitutionalization. So again, the ideal was to banish the large central institution and instead care for people with mental illness in their communities. This is also a time that I found really interesting because there was a lot of activism in the 1960s and 70s, and just as there were civil rights movements for black civil rights, women's rights, and then later LGBT people, there was also the emergence of disability rights activism and institutionalized people's activism, and that ends up informing a lot of the policies. And these are just some that often get hidden or not known too much about in Philadelphia, and so I just wanted to share them. One is a family protest at Pennhurst, the other is the Prisoners' Rights Council here in Philadelphia, and then the Alliance for the Liberation of Mental Patients, which formed in the 70s and was a major ex-patients organization. So in this tumultuous time of change, community mental health, one of the things that's fascinating and that informs this place at Eastern State is that community mental health ended up overflowing into community corrections. So just as there was this belief that big mental institutions were outdated, so there was a belief that big prisons, such as the one we're sitting in right now, was totally inappropriate to hold people or rehabilitate people. So the Bureau of Corrections, this is from the early 70s, had a changing concept in which, again, this is published by the Bureau of Corrections at the time, in which their idea of reform in their new programs is literally to move people back to their communities, to take care of them in their communities. And I think, although again there might be people in this room who can clarify, my impression from reading documents is that when Eastern State closed, there was actually fewer number of people in the prison system than there were beds. That's from reading news articles. And actually, the ideal in closing Eastern State was that there would be no more maximum security prisons built in this area. Again, it was seen as closing down this type and moving more to community-based prisons. So to me, it's just really fascinating. I've lived in a time where it's always building more building more prison beds, but really the late 60s and 70s were a time of change. With that said, the 60s and 70s, there were also the rise of law and order politics. And what I found is that the fears of rising crime and urban riots, and also a lot of fear-based politics around civil disobedience, ended up fueling a political backlash against those community programs and community corrections programs such as this one. They ended up rolling back furloughs, probation and parole was significantly cut back, and pardons dramatically dropped, so that by the later 1970s, most of those programs were gone. What I then found is that first there was a backlash against community corrections, and then there was a real focus on mandatory minimum sentencing and harsher sentencing and keeping prisoners in there for longer. And that really drove the beginning, I think it's the late 70s and then 80s and 90s, the building of prisons in this country. And so I'll conclude this section just with the final piece that I've really been looking at in my dissertation, is how not only in Pennsylvania, but then across the country, many mental hospitals were actually converted into prisons in the process of prison building. So actually, SCI Crescent was a former state hospital. Farview State Hospital up in northeastern Pennsylvania was turned into one state prison and a federal prison. And then Retreat State Hospital was also converted into prisons. So again, into a prison. So to me, the abandoned asylum, in some ways, they weren't always abandoned, and actually many of them turned into prisons across the country. So haunted histories, and what do I do? So this is my research most of my day, and then I try to think about haunted histories. Before I begin, just some comments and thoughts on haunted histories, and then opening it up for discussion. I want to totally come clean that I have never, in fact, been to a haunted asylum or a haunted prison. And I was trying to figure out on my way over here whether it was more frightening to go to Terror Behind the Walls or to lead a discussion about Terror Behind the Walls, having not gone to Terror Behind the Walls. The jury is out, and I'll be going in October. What I do offer and what I bring to this discussion, though, is my knowledge of the history of both mental health and also prisons, and also my work in public history and the importance of public memory on how things are remembered and popular memory. To me, these haunted histories, however complicated, are important, and they really do shape people's concepts of how we think of prisons and mental asylums. Today, I've hoped to show two main things. The first is that as a country, we've had a long history of confining people in government institutions, both for rehabilitation and for the protection of society. It's not something that just has mushroomed in the last few decades, but actually there's this much longer history of institutionalization in America. The second is that I think that we're still struggling with the meanings and the future of involuntary confinement in this country. In prison reform, there are again efforts to find community-based alternatives to prisons, particularly with the economic crisis, and to try to find less expensive alternatives to large prisons. So there are three thoughts that I want to put out there, and then I'm actually probably going to leave this podium so I can actually lead discussions. These are my three main thoughts. I have many thoughts about these histories, but these are three that I'll throw out there, and then really welcome your thoughts on these haunted histories and what they mean. The first is that in Pennsylvania right now, 51,000 people live in prisons. While while those prisons are not haunted houses and they're not nearly as in bad shape as Eastern State Penitentiary, there are still cell blocks, guards, people who can't leave, and incarceration and involuntary confinement. And so one question that I've been chewing over has been, does this major popular interest in Eastern State Penitentiary's haunted attractions, does that actually reflect a dis-ease with confinement in America? Does this show that as a society we are uncomfortable with mass incarceration, with the highest rates of incarceration in the world? Because it's not just here at Eastern State, but actually there are many others. I have one in Illinois myself. Like, prisons are a place that are haunted all the time. Or the second, if they can be entertaining, does it show a total comfort with incarceration in America? Does the fact that we can have haunted attractions make it more acceptable? I'm not sure, but it's a question that I gnaw on and I throw out there for you. The second is that from Illinois this past year, I've been fascinated by the controversies over Pennhurst State School and whether or not it should be made into a haunted attraction. This is a photograph from ABC News of a simulated room in the Pennhurst Asylum. And what's interesting to me is it's not only a patient and also signs of disability, but also the bars on the windows, which might be there, but certainly they're a part of the frame of that picture. The major criticisms that people gave against Pennhurst was, one, that it stigmatized people with disabilities. Two, it erased the history of the place and the people who had lived and worked there. And three, that it seemed to undermine efforts to memorialize the history of Pennhurst and also the history of people with disabilities. So from afar in Illinois, I was wondering, do those thoughts and criticisms also ring true here at Eastern State? Do haunted attractions further stigmatize people with criminal records or people who have served time? And also, does it foster a culture of fear around the history of prisons and make them opaque to discussions and critical thinking? And then my final thought, as a public historian, and that I can't come back to, is just that there's a huge popular interest in it. This is where people are at. They find these places scary, and they want to come to them to be scared. So even with the ethical dilemmas of these places, are there ways to meet people where they're at? Certainly, in some ways, Eastern State is really meeting people where they're at, and that people are coming to this. I'd love to think that this is a popular talk, but I don't think that you could sell $50 a pop to come and listen to me, right? People are coming to Eastern State in large part because of the haunted attractions, the terror behind the walls. So that said, are there ways to be able to link, not just here at Eastern State, but also at Pennhurst, to be able to meet people where they're at and teach the history of institutions for mental health disabilities, but also the history of prisons by engaging in these haunted history, by basically providing it and then offering a way to teach about the history of institutionalization. I really, truly thank Eastern State for having this conversation. It's really wonderful, and thank you for coming out and listening on this very hot day. Like, I just wish there was that fan coming out and just blowing off. So please, I'm gonna come down now and hopefully lead a discussion, but I'm really interested in your comments, both on some of my research, but also on what you think about what these haunted histories mean, and also ways to move forward here at Eastern State, but then also at Pennhurst. So thank you. I appreciate it. Ooh, man. Are there any questions? Or?
And often the shows will take or make up stories involving the history and stuff like that. And I feel like it's made people even more focused on looking for grotesque or ghost-like things rather than, well, I don't know if you've done any research on stuff like that, or whether it's new development, or.
So what you're saying is that there's this more, like, also just this interest in, like, is it paranormal activity or like, or
Yeah.
ghosts at
Sure, there's like really popular guys who go out now, they go around all places around the world and they hunt for ghosts, and so a lot of people, I would say, it's definitely opened up the positive aspect of it is it's opened up people who never come here, that wasn't for their shows, they've never even thought about it, and maybe they're opening to history as a result, but also constantly you get statements about the mad chair, which is the barber chair, or, you know, the guard getting stabbed here, or, you know, stories that were created, that aren't really based in fact, like I was trying to do. Is a huge.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've done any research on that, because that is sort of related to haunted houses.
No, it's really interesting because I think at Penn, I actually don't know too much about ghost hunters, and except that there's a ghost hunters at Byberry before it was redeveloped. It's now totally redeveloped for the most part, but there were ghost hunters there. But I also know that at Pennhurst recently there have been these big debates over the haunted house, but then there's also, I think some of the only people who've been able to get into Pennhurst have been ghost hunters. I think there's been this rise in interest in ghost hunters and then going in.
It's the same
And
kind
they-
of night time here. It's
Right.
basically only ghost hunters who can
Yeah.
come in at night.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, but I don't, I mean, I think that there is something there. There's a woman told me that this question, she may even be here, I think, Kelly George, who's at Temple, PhD student. I think that you were saying that it wasn't, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but yeah, no, that haunted places and the hazards of paranormal activity was also, you know, that there's some writing on, does that happen more? Are people more interested in ghosts and paranormal activity at places that are like open wounds in our society? Like places that raise more ethical problems? So that's just something to think about. Yeah.
Well, along those lines, how common is this? How, you know, there's, you know, we're blessed apparently with two of them in our area, Pennhurst and Eastern State, but how common is it across the country of prisons and mental hospitals as the sites for haunted houses?
I was doing research into it, and I found them in many places. I have to say, I'm not sure how many abandoned prisons there are.
Yeah.
But there are far more abandoned hospitals, and I found many more of those. What I found that fleshes it out, and I'll throw this out there, the reason I really think this is a big issue beyond Pennhurst and beyond Eastern State is that there are reenactments, haunted reenactments. So in Illinois, we have a made-up state bill. They've kind of recreated a prison there. You know, so that there's been an insanitarium built somewhere in which, you know, they take a place and they turn it into an insanitarium. There are a lot of prisons. So it's both buildings to some extent, but also then reenactments at different places. And then the other thing that I think is important, or at least interesting, is that there's this huge internet culture that really is pretty fear-based. A lot of websites about old hospitals. I'm not sure as much prisons, but I mean, just a lot of your, you know, I also think of Shutter Island, or the, you know, like, I think that these point to this much bigger culture of fear-based popular culture representations of hospitals and prisons.
I'd like to respond to your question and ask a question. To your question about what might draw people to a place like this or Pennhurst, I believe that many of us have almost a morbid curiosity about places that we wouldn't otherwise have access to. Very few of us have been incarcerated either because we broke the law or because we had a medical issue. And especially since the internet offers us access to so much, there are a few kind of undiscovered places, and this could be one of them. So whether it's part of Terror Behind the Walls, or the daytime tours, or the gallery open to the art installations, I really do believe that this place draws people because it's so unique to their experience. My question is, does your research include any exploration either of the sensory deprivation that would come from being in a place like this in its early years when it was a place of penitence and a place, it was the separate system, or the sensory overload that comes from either the silent system, the conjugal system, where people are just so tightly packed together that they actually get disoriented from either of those two extremes.
Well, I'll answer that question, your question, and then I'll pose it to and then I'll put it to the I actually have been, I'm a U.S. cultural historian, so I study the policies and the politics around these places largely. And the more I do it, the more I'm realizing that I really need to, and not only need to, but I've really started trying to read the personal accounts of people who are institutionalized and prisoners, what their experiences of the places are. And so that's the mid-20th century. So I have to say, at this point, I can't really answer it, but I really do. I've kind of learned that I think it's incredibly important to be able to get these narratives of what, of people's experiences. I did want to put out your comment, though, if I got it correctly, to the group and just try to hear what people's thoughts are, which is, so the comment is that this is a way, that haunted places are a way for people to go, for instance, to Penhurst, to be able to see an institution that was a former state school, going to the haunted house is a way to see that, or here at Eastern State, that's a way to see it. And what do you guys think about that? Whether that's a good reason.
Well, it sort of builds on that, but I do wonder if there's like this, like a human curiosity about how we've punished people, how we've passed, whether it be drawn and quartered or the rack, or there's always been some sort of horror or fascination, it seems, with how we treat our offenders. And in that same vein, I'm almost thinking that this form of incarceration is almost, especially the isolation, is now obsolete. Like, we don't do those things anymore. And I wonder if historically there's an interest because this is a way that we don't treat people anymore. Good question.
Yeah.
Just one correction on that. Indeed, prisoners do remain in isolated circumstances, however they do.
Yeah, and I have to say the Cook County Jail, the psychiatric ward, we were walking, Sean took me on a tour, and it didn't necessarily look, it wasn't as dilapidated as this, but I felt like I was walking through the psychiatric ward at Cook County Jail, which was largely solitary, and individual cells. So it is still happening, but I do think that that is a question. Do people think it's still happening, or I think one thing I do wonder is, do people know it's still happening? What are their concepts of it?
I think that I was interested by when you refer to these locations as like a wound in society, and I think that my impression is that a lot of people view it more as just an organ of our society, and that somehow these places must somehow be essential and must somehow be necessary. And so there is a lot of curiosity about it because they are shrouded and they are hidden from our view a lot of the time. But I don't think that, I think a lot of people don't come here with the sense that there's something broken or wrong with these systems.
Right. It's more seeing something they can't see
Yeah.
otherwise. That's a good thing.
Stepping back a little bit, it just seems to me that one of the fundamental reasons why prisons, current prisons and foreign prisons are fascinating is because the whole concept of prison, it goes directly contrary to the basic American culture, where we're all taught and raised to believe in self-determinism, individual freedom, the opportunity to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everything about America is built around that culture. And then we have this totally opposite culture of people who, for whatever reason, are deemed not to meet the minimum standards for the mainstream culture, and they're put into these institutions. And particularly with mental institutions where they can be kept there for the rest of life against the will, and there's absolutely, virtually no legal recourse for many of them. I mean, we're all struck by that incredible paradox. The fact that that is so different from the whole political and cultural history of this country. And I think that paradox is what underlies our fascination with prisons generally, and our fascination with old prisons, with unusual railings and scary features. And that paradox is what we're very uncomfortable with, because we want to believe we live in a country where there's maximum freedom and opportunity to succeed, but at the same time we live in a society that has more prisons than any other society in the world, and locks more people up. And it's a real paradox, and I think that underlies a lot of our fascination, our fear, and our curiosity.
So for you, it is more of a wound, like, you know, there.
Yeah, but it's not a wound confined to one small subset of society. It's an open wound that the entire society suffers, because we're all interested in coming to a haunted house tour, or to find out what's really going inside a mental institution that we've never been inside. And that's because, in part, it's so contrary, I think, to what we think of America being all about.
I think that's really interesting, and I do want to make one clarification about mental health commitment laws, which I didn't talk about too much there, which is that mental health commitment laws were changed in the 70s, and I didn't talk about it earlier, but they were changed so that that involuntary confinement just because you're mentally ill or because you have an intellectual disability is no longer legal, except if the person is dangerous to himself or others, which is a major. So there are people who end up staying for many years because they're dangerous to others. And I also do want to put out there that this connection between liberty, this question of liberty is really big. In the decade after the Civil War, there was this huge flurry of lawsuits by mental patients for their freedom, saying that their liberties had been taken away during this period. And it's actually, it's almost like the 1860s and 70s, and then the 1960s and 70s are major times of change in mental health law. At the very same time that there are questions of liberty and justice in those times. So I do want to just put that out there to think about. Yes?
You've got your hands full comparing mental hospitals
I agree.
and prisons, but
I agree.
if you looked at the fact that large buildings occupied or unoccupied have the same kind of